Nothing I have seen or heard in the past few weeks has shaken my firm opinion that with a reasonable measure of goodwill between the communities, a unified India would be far the best solution of the problem.
Well, I'll tell you, I finally got the Marconiphone open. It took a while to figure out what I was doing. It's got this clever latch on the back that allows you to open up. It says here, the model P20B personal receiver. And this is quite a clever design. I'm looking inside, I see 4 valves, and I've got a little cheat sheet here because I can tell you some of these were quite alien to me. I didn't understand tube designators like X17 and W17 and ZD17 and so on. But it turns out those are some of the first generation battery tubes developed by Marconi. And these go hand in hand with the American first generation battery tubes, the 1R5, 1T4, 1S5, and so on. So I think you can substitute those back and forth. I had to consult my Australian Philips mini-watt technical data to figure out what these tubes were. This was owned by a guy from Victoria, a Neil Fraser, VK3 Bravo Tango Sierra. I don't know how I got this book, but thank you for sending this over. This really saved me. I could have just looked in my Howard Sam's tube substitution book because it's all right on the very last page. This is the foreign to American page of the Howard Sam's tube substitution manual, but they're all right in there. So lots to cover. Of course, the question is, what do I want to accomplish with this little set? It has a lot of blemishes. It has some cracked plastic. It's going to need some obvious repair and a little bit of restoration. I don't expect it to be able to pick up very much because it has a very small antenna, but I will find a way to get some signals into it. I will go through the circuit, tune it up. It's important that we figure out how to power it, so I'll make a small power supply for it. And I think I want to make up a battery pack. I think that should be part of this video series. We should be able to make a battery pack for this radio, and it runs on 67 volts and 1.5 volts or 1.4 volts. And the radio would actually probably operate successfully from 35 volts to probably 100 volts. But the sweet spot is probably between 50 and 70 volts for the HT on this radio. Okay, I've opened it up so we can take a look. I want to talk about the valves just for a moment. The miniature battery valves with the B7G series were basically developed in 1939 to 1940 by RCA in the US. Rapid development of equivalents took place as RCA was interested in licensing other manufacturers. General Electric was probably the second source. These tubes were used in some military equipment in World War II, including the famous BC-611 walkie-talkie, and certainly by 1943, 1944, they were being used extensively in spy sets that were dropped into Europe. Other manufacturers include Mazda, Philips, Mullard, and so on. So Marconi did their set in 1947, and that's the same year that this portable radio came out. So as soon as they had the battery valves developed, the P20B went into production. In the US, newer versions of these valves were being developed, and these became standard in the UK by 1955. These included tubes like the 3V4, which had improved audio performance for driving the speaker. Finally, a better converter came along in 1949, pretty late in the game. It's the 1L6. This is the tube used in the famous Zenith Transoceanic, it has higher frequency performance for the shortwave bands. Interestingly enough, the Marconiphone is not really made by Marconi. Marconi sold off the name to the gramophone company. This was a huge complex in Hayes, Middlesex, and basically this is an industrial city that had all kinds of manufacturing, wartime and commercial, and back and forth. A lot of the industries converted to military manufacturing during the wars. But this is a very famous area in England that has to do with the vinyl record industry, EMI records, and so on. As you can see, the tubes that I've got shown here, V1, V2, V3, and V4. By the way, the V stands for valve. They have valves in Britain. We have tubes over here, and in Australia they have dubes. I think that starts with a D. Tubes, perhaps a CH. The equivalents I've got in red. So the 1R5 converter, for instance, is the X17 or the DK91. So these are all considered first generation battery tubes. So our little Marconiphone turns out to be an interesting radio because this is what's known as a ladies' radio. This is a radio that is meant to be in the boudoir, perhaps on the beach, because it's totally battery operated, has its internal antenna. Matter of fact, my cat Bella is interested in this radio. She's wandering around here making noise. These first generation portables, the battery sets, basically are single conversion super heterodynes. They follow the standard frequency converter followed by an IF stage, and then an audio detector tube, and finally an amplifier for the speaker. This one uses a 365 kilohertz IF. The radio actually tunes from 150 kilohertz to 300 kilohertz in the long wave band, and 545 to around 1500 kilohertz in the medium frequency broadcast band. We can't use low side injection. We have to use high side injection, because how are you going to get 365 kilohertz below 150 kilohertz? So both bands are high side injection. Let's take a look at the Marconiphone P20B's schematic. Looking at L1, that's the loop antenna that's in the lid, we can see that L1 has an extension inductor, L2, which allows it to resonate at the lower long wave frequencies. This first tube, the converter, V1, translates the input to a 365 kilohertz IF. That IF is amplified by V2. It's a single stage of IF amplification. And then we have a diode detector in V3. There's a volume control, and then some voltage amplification before sending it over to V4, which is the amplifier that drives that little speaker. And it is a very little speaker. One of the complaints on this radio is that it sounds a little bit tinny because of essentially what we would call today a transistor radio speaker. There is automatic gain control, negative AGC, developed by the diode in V3, and it's fed back to the IF amplifier V2 as well as the converter stage V1. All of the valves have their filaments basically in parallel, which means that this thing draws 250 milliamps approximately. If they had put the filaments in series and run it on a higher voltage A battery, I think it would have had better battery life. The HT, or high tension current draw is around 8 milliamps at 67 volts. The first generation battery tubes were developed just before the war, and they did find their way into some wartime devices, such as the MAB and DAV Navy and Marine walkie-talkies, as well as the BC 611 walkie-talkie. This is the MAB walkie-talkie that was developed. MAB means Marine Airborne, and this unit came out of a development of a company in Coral Gables, Florida, from 1940 to 1942. Basically, it's a single channel transceiver, AM, and it uses this first generation of battery tubes. And this particular transceiver would be used on a Marine paratrooper. So an invasion type paratrooper would use this probably to get on an island, and the idea was to call in airstrikes or artillery from ships. So the set is in a waterproof container. And basically, you've got this fiberglass kind of container. And inside you have the transceiver and the battery pack. Okay, so this is the transceiver. As you can see, it's ultra compact, and it uses those battery tubes inside. This is approximately a 200 milliwatt AM transmitter and a single conversion super heterodyne, all in this miniature package. So this is 1942 vintage, and I have it crystalled up for 3885 AM, believe it or not. But these two are very related. Both are miniature technology, both use the first generation battery tubes. So that's why I wanted to show you the military application of these tubes before it became something that was used in the commercial world for broadcast use. This is a little booklet that goes with it. That shows how a Marine might have the walkie-talkie. If you're going to be jumping, it's part of the chest pack for a paratrooper. So whether these were used or not in World War II, I have no idea, but certainly they would have been something that were deployed during the island hopping campaign. This introductory video on the Marconi P20B was meant to just familiarize people with the company, with some of the technology using the battery tubes. And in the next video we'll get into the troubleshooting, some of the basic stabilization and repair on this vintage radio. And we'll start to talk about power supplies and maybe get some sound out of it.